Liberalism section. Criticism of liberalism as anti-modern reaction. In fact, we encounter a paradoxical phenomenon. While on the one hand, it cultivated pre-modern nostalgia, on the other, liberalism contested the movement engaged in the demand for political rights and economic and social rights, accusing it of a basic inability to understand and accept modernity. The first to set off in this direction was Constant. Clinging to the idea of unanimous participation in political life, and hence to, quote, ancient liberty, the Jacobins forgot that the latter was based on slavery, the institution that made it possible for free men to enjoy the otium required for them to be genuinely active citizens in every respect. It was 1819 when the French liberal argued thus. At this time, in every country where modern liberty flourished, slavery continued in one form or another to be a living reality, and, what is more, had assumed a harshness and naturalistic rigidity unknown in classical antiquity. Certainly, although it had not ceased to play a significant role, the institution was mostly isolated and concealed in the colonies. But that was not the case in the United States. There, slavery was not only highly visible, but, according to the analysis of not a few Southern theorists, who took up and developed a suggestion of Burke's, it encouraged the Republican spirit of the free. In other words, quote, ancient liberty continued to survive in some sense in the United States, which was nevertheless pointed to by Constant as a great example of the modern liberty dear to him. On the other hand, in stressing the invigorating function that the presence of slaves had on the spirit of liberty of free citizens, Burke explicitly referred to the example of the ancient states. Hence, Constant's theoretical construct is based on a colossal repression, which is all the more amazing if we bear in mind the bitter struggles over slavery that developed in France. Abolished by the Jacobins, it had been restored by Napoleon, who arrived in power with the support not only of Sieyès, but also, as we shall see, of Constant himself. Rather than emulating a model from antiquity, the French Revolution and the most radical currents thrown up by it were sometimes accused of encouraging nostalgia for the Middle Ages. Spencer compared progressive taxation to a corvée. This was a theme subsequently developed by him, with the observation that, quote, national charity, i.e. laws benefiting the poor, was merely a new version of the pre-modern, established church. And just as the old dissenter had fought for respect for the spontaneity of authentic religious sentiment, so the new, quote, dissenter from a poor law maintains that charity will always be more extensive and more beneficial when it is voluntary, end quote. While the old dissenter denied any authority the right to dictate laws to his religious conscience, the new, quote, dissenter from established charity objects that no man has a right to step in between him and the exercise of his religion, and indignantly rejected, quote, the interference of the state in the exercise of one of the most important precepts of the gospel, end quote. In the last analysis, the demand for economic and social rights to be legally ratified in the name of moral and religious values such as compassion and human solidarity were simply a claim to restore life to a state religion. And the prophets of this state religion likewise referred to a pre-modern world. From the French Revolution onwards, as we shall soon see, the liberal tradition was fond of equating trade unions with medieval corporations. Even at the end of the 19th century, Lecky reproved trade unions and the working class movement for aspiring to an, quote, industrial organization similar to that of the Middle Ages and the Tudor period. Trade unions, Pareto stressed some years later, claimed to enjoy and did enjoy a kind of, quote, medieval immunity. In Lord Acton's view, even more so than the demand by unions for alleged economic and social rights. It was that for universal suffrage that amounted to a pre-modern, regressive phenomenon. It was, quote, absolutist and retrograde, since it favored the expansion of the state and of despotism that had happily been transcended by liberalism. In conclusion, Rather than classical antiquity, as for Constant, Jacobinism, socialism, and sometimes democracy itself were now accused of cultivating nostalgia for the Ancien Regime, whether it was of the Middle Ages or absolute monarchy. The latter theme found fullest expression in de Tocqueville, according to whom, with their statist pathos, radicalism, Jacobinism, and socialism were in a line of continuity with the statism, quote, administrative centralization, and paternal government of the Ancien Regime. However, this was an argument which, albeit with timely variations, proved especially dear to defenders of the Ancien Regime themselves. In Berlin, the Berliner Politische Wochenblatt never tired of repeating that revolution and absolutism were, quote, identical when regarded from a higher viewpoint. In citing Louis XIV's motto, C'est l'État, c'est moi, the journal observed that, quote, revolutionary freedom is reconciled with this centralization, this bureaucratic despotism, with this tutelage through ministerial assistance of the provinces and the community, with this Hobbesian governmental omnipotence. End quote. De Tocqueville stressed the revolutionary role played, even before 1789, by the figure of the intendant and public administration, which had in fact already expelled the nobility. The periodical cited above arrived at the same conclusion, identifying and branding in the figure of the, quote, civil servant, the author of the cancellation of local liberties, and all intermediate bodies liable to overshadow state power. According to de Tocqueville, quote, those peoples who are so constituted as to have the utmost difficulty in getting rid of despotic government for any considerable period are the ones in which aristocracy has ceased to exist and can no longer exist. End quote. But this was precisely the guiding thread of the condemnation of the French Revolution pronounced by the organ of the Prussian nobility. Immediately after the publication of The Ancien Regime and the Revolution, expressing his agreement and admiration, Lieber observed that the book as a whole was a historical running commentary on the analysis of Gallican political tendencies he had already developed. Obviously, a degree of boasting is not absent. Yet we should understand the German-American liberal's point of view. In 1849, he had underlined the continuity between Louis XIV and the 1789 Revolution, and between it and Napoleon Bonaparte and the 1848 Revolution. It was a history utterly pervaded by the ideal of, quote, equality and the concentration and centralization of power, the organization and generalized interference of public power, with the consequent inevitable sacrifice of freedom, individualism, and the principle of the limitation of government. By contrast, the latter was at the heart of the concerns and aspirations of the Britannic or Anglican race, i.e. England and the United States. We are, I repeat, in 1849, and at this time de Tocqueville confined himself to an indictment of socialism. While, quote, on many points it had a different orientation from the Ancien Regime, it had inherited the opinion that the only wisdom lies in the state. End quote. But the partial and limited continuity established here did not in any way include the French Revolution. In fact, in his anti-socialist polemic, de Tocqueville did not hesitate to refer to Robespierre. Beginning of long quote. Flee the old mania of wanting to govern excessively. Allow individuals, allow families the right freely to do anything that does not harm others. Allow the communes the right to manage their own affairs. In a word, restore to the liberty of individuals everything that has illegitimately been taken from them, everything that does not of necessity pertain to the public authority. End quote. At this time, far from formulating the thesis of continuity between the Ancien Regime and the Revolution, de Tocqueville was refuting it in advance. Someone who did support it was Lieber, who was in a sense justified in claiming priority. In fact, it must be added that, by his own explicit admission, he had derived the thesis from Niebuhr, whose disciple he considered himself to be, and, more generally, from the German culture he had absorbed before leaving Prussia at the age of 27. In the first instance, the thesis of continuity between the Ancien Regime and the Revolution met with great success in the countries where the Ancien Regime proved most tenacious. We are clearly dealing with a rhetorical strategy. The revolutionary movement that claimed to be constructing a new world was branded as antiquated. Yet the strains are obvious. If we analyze the arguments of the various exponents of the liberal tradition, we see that the French Revolution and Jacobinism are variously situated in a line of continuity with classical antiquity, the Middle Ages, and monarchical absolutism. The past to which the new is returned and reduced can assume the most diverse forms. Thus, the Revolution was criticized with arguments that are difficult to reconcile with one another, and which are even opposed. On the one hand, it was accused of having destroyed the intermediate bodies that predated the advent of the absolute state. On the other, of wanting to preserve or reintroduce bodies, such as trade unions, that pertained to feudal particularism, and that tended to take the form of a state within the state. In the light of subsequent historical experience, it is difficult to regard the demand for economic and social rights, in our day also ratified by the UN, as pre-modern, and contrariwise the view, which was not foreign even to de Tocqueville, regarding mass poverty as a datum of nature pertaining to providence, rather than determined politico-social relations, as modern. And still, with reference to the French liberal, it is difficult to reconcile condemnation of Jacobinism and socialism as movements situated in the wake of the Ancien Regime, with alarmist and apocalyptic denunciation of the, quote, new race of delirious ideologues and agitators who menaced, quote, European civilization, in fact, civilization as such, with an unprecedented danger. End section.